My name is Ellie, Eleanor Reed. For most of my life, those two words felt less like a name and more like a title, a designation for the person responsible for the invisible labor that holds a family together. I was the one who knew which shirt Robert would want to wear on a Tuesday, the one who remembered which of Jessica's college friends were a good influence, and the one who could tell from the way Daniel sighed whether he needed a hug or just a quiet moment. My life wasn't a whirlwind. It was a carefully curated garden, and I was the constant, diligent hand that kept it from becoming a tangled mess. The garden metaphor felt particularly apt on the day of our 25th wedding anniversary. Robert had planned a grand affair at the country club, a spectacle of success designed not for us, but for the 200 guests he'd invited. I had wanted something simpler. Dinner at our favorite Italian restaurant, a quiet night with just the kids, a toast to the quarter century we'd spent building a life. But Robert had dismissed the idea with a wave of his hand, the way he dismissed most things that didn't fit his grand vision. Ellie, it's not just about us, he'd said, not looking up from his phone. It's about our brand, our legacy. He'd said the words brand and legacy with a gravitas usually reserved for a CEO's retirement speech. I had simply nodded and started calling the caterer to add more vegan options for the Harrisons. My role, I had long ago learned, was to ensure his vision appeared seamless, no matter how much effort it required in the shadows. Our children arrived just before the party was to begin, filling the silence of the house with a welcomed cacophony. Jessica, our eldest, strode through the front door in a perfectly tailored pantsuit, her phone already to her ear. She was a brilliant architect, with her father's ambition and a relentless work ethic that made me proud and sometimes afraid. She was a skyscraper of a person, all steel and glass. She gave me a quick hug that felt more like a quick check-in. Mom, are the flowers here? I told them white lilies, not roses. It clashes with the aesthetic. She was already in party mode, a reflection of the man she was becoming more like every day. Daniel, our youngest, followed her in, carrying a large canvas wrapped in brown paper. He was a different kind of soul, an artist who saw the world in shades of light and shadow, not in profit margins. He had his father's height but his mother's heart, an old soul in a young man's body. He smelled of turpentine and something earthy, something real. He embraced me fully, his arms wrapping around me in a hug that felt like coming home. "Hey, Mom," he whispered. "Happy anniversary. I brought you something." He gestured to the painting, and I felt my heart swell with a familiar warmth. Robert appeared from the study, a glass of scotch in his hand and a professional smile on his face. "There are my two-star pupils," he said, his voice loud enough for the whole house to hear. He clapped Daniel on the shoulder and gave Jessica a kiss on the cheek. "Jess, I just closed the deal on the new development in Tribeca. They want your firm on it. I'll make a few calls." He was already planning her next move, a chess master arranging his pieces on the board. He barely paused for her congratulations, his mind already 3 steps ahead. Then he turned to Daniel and his smile faltered. His eyes fell on the wrapped canvas in Daniel's hands. "What's that, son? Another one of your hobbies?" The word hobbies was a thinly veiled jab, the same kind of subtle cruelty he used to diminish anything he couldn't monetize. Daniel's shoulders tightened. "It's for Mom, for the anniversary," he said, his voice losing its usual warmth. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a beautiful, intricate oil painting. It was a portrait of our family, but not in the sterile, posed way of a photograph. It showed us in the backyard, laughing, with the sun setting behind us. Daniel had captured not just our faces, but our spirit, the fleeting moments of genuine happiness that held us together. I gasped, my hand flying to my mouth. It was perfect. "Oh, Daniel, it's beautiful," I said, my voice thick with emotion. Robert's reaction was colder. He stared at the painting, his professional mask slipping to reveal a flash of irritation. "It's nice, son, but is it practical? You know, people can't live in a painting. We need to be focused on a tangible future." We talked about law school, or at least an MBA. The subtext was clear. This was a waste of time, a frivolous pursuit for a serious man. "Dad, it's art. It's what I love," Daniel said, his voice rising in frustration. "Love doesn't pay the bills. Love doesn't build a legacy." Robert retorted, his face hardening. You're wasting your potential on this. He gestured dismissively at the painting. The air grew thick with unspoken resentments. It was the same old fight, a conversation they'd had 100 times. Daniel wanted to paint to create, to find beauty in the world. Robert wanted him to conform, to succeed, to build an empire. The unspoken argument hung between them like a physical thing, a storm gathering on a hot summer day. I stepped between them, my hand reaching for Daniel's arm, my other hand trying to rest on Robert's chest. "It's a beautiful gift, Robert, it's from the heart." But it was too late. Robert's face contorted, a flush rising on his neck. His hand, which had been clutching his glass of scotch, shook violently. He took a sharp, gasping breath. The color drained from his face, replaced by a ghastly pallor. His eyes, fixed on Daniel, widened in a look of profound shock. He clutched his chest with a clenched fist. The scotch glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor. A sharp crack, followed by a deeper, more profound silence. Robert sank to his knees, his face a mask of sudden pain and fear. The last sound he made was a choked, guttural gasp. Then he collapsed, his body hitting the floor with a hollow thud. The painting, a beautiful portrait of a happy family that no longer existed, stood on the floor, untouched, its colors vibrant and alive. My world, the one I had so carefully tended, had just shattered. And as I stared at my husband's still form, I knew that this wasn't the end of our story. It was simply the beginning of a different one entirely. The crash of the scotch glass seemed to echo forever in the stunned silence of the living room. For a full, suspended moment, no one moved. The air hung thick with the sharp scent of alcohol, and a silence so profound it was deafening. I was the first to act, my body moving on instinct. I was kneeling beside Robert's inert form, my hands shaking as I felt for a pulse that wasn't there. Jessica was on her phone, already barking commands into the receiver, her voice a fragile, controlled thing as she called 911. Daniel was simply frozen, his hands still clutching the beautiful, terrible painting, his face ashen, his eyes wide with a horror I had never seen. I looked up at him, a silent plea passing between us before a team of paramedics stormed through the front door, their bags and equipment a brutal, clinical splash of color against the elegant neutrality of our home. The next few hours were a blur of sterile urgency and hushed conversations. The paramedics, the police, a few sympathetic neighbors who had seen the flashing lights, they all moved through our perfect, manicured life like ghosts, leaving no lasting impressions except for the deep gouges their boots made on our hardwood floor. The moment the coroner confirmed what we already knew, it was as if an invisible thread connecting us all had been severed. Jessica's face became a mask of professional efficiency, already planning, already delegating. "We need to contact the funeral home. He's with Pierce and Sons. We need to secure his office files." Her grief was a practical thing expressed through a to-do list a mile long. Daniel, on the other hand, was a ship without a rudder. He sat on the sofa, still holding his painting, a silent monument to the chaos that had just unfolded. He hadn't spoken a word since Robert fell, a stillness that felt more frightening to me than Jessica's frantic energy. The first hint of the strange path we were about to walk came 2 days later at the funeral home. Just as the last of the mourners began to trickle out, a man with a tired, kind face stepped forward. He introduced himself as Frank Johnson, Robert's longtime attorney. He had a gentle voice that seemed entirely out of place in such a sterile environment. "Mrs. Reed, Jessica, Daniel," he said, his gaze settling on each of us in turn. "Robert made some specific arrangements. He wanted me to meet with you all in my office on Friday to read his will." His words were clipped and professional, yet there was a deep sadness in his eyes, as if he knew something we didn't. Later that evening, the fragile peace of our home was shattered again by the quiet, creeping conflict that began to take root between my children. Jessica and Daniel were in the living room, the air thick with unspoken accusation. "I'm sorry, Daniel," Jessica said, her voice betraying not an ounce of remorse. "But the firm needs to be protected. You know Dad wanted me to take over to continue his legacy." The word legacy, once a source of pride, now tasted like ash. Daniel's face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed. Legacy, is that all you can think about? Dad just died, Jess. He was yelling at me right before. I just can't believe you're already worried about money. He still hadn't let go of the painting. Someone has to be practical. Jessica shot back, her voice rising. Someone has to deal with his estate, his clients, the entire future of this family. You're just a hobbyist. What do you know about managing a multimillion-dollar law firm? And what do you know about being a human being? Daniel's retort was a low, gut-wrenching whisper. I watched them, my heart breaking for the two people who were once so close, now standing on opposite sides of an invisible divide. One was focused on the future, the other trapped in the past. They were both grieving, but in ways so fundamentally different that they couldn't see the pain in the other. I tried to step in, to mediate, to remind them that they had just lost their father, but my words fell on deaf ears. Their conflict was already too big, too deeply rooted in the years of unspoken tension under Robert's domineering shadow. All of his calculated moves to secure their futures had, in death, created a chasm between them. I knew then that my carefully tended garden had been trampled. This was more than just a family in mourning. This was a family at war. And as the lawyer's appointment loomed, I felt a familiar, cold dread settle in my stomach. The silence that had filled the house after Robert's death was deceptive. It wasn't a period of rest. It was a holding of breath, a calm before a storm that I could feel brewing right under our feet. The will, I realized, would not be a simple division of assets. It would be the final, most cunning move of a man who had always, in life and now in death, held all the cards. The mahogany door to Frank Johnson's office felt as heavy and final as a tombstone. It was a beautiful Friday morning, the kind of day that felt like a slap in the face with its sheer, unadulterated cheerfulness. Sunlight streamed through the large windows of the downtown law firm, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, oblivious to the grim purpose that had brought us all here. I sat on a plush leather sofa, with Jessica rigid and silent beside me. Her elegant suit looked like a suit of armor, and she was already scrolling through her phone, not a flicker of emotion on her face. Daniel was on my other side, slouching in a chair that was too big for him. He was a million miles away, staring out the window at the cityscape, his jaw tight. Neither of them had spoken more than a handful of words to me since the night of the party. Frank Johnson entered the room with a stack of thick folders in his hands, his face a mask of professional solemnity. He was a man who had seen it all, a silent confidante to the secrets of the city's elite. He gestured for us to sit around a large oak table that dominated the room. The folders were laid out with an almost reverent care. "Thank you all for coming," Frank began, his voice low and steady. "This is never an easy process, but Robert was very specific about how he wanted things to proceed. He put on a pair of reading glasses, his fingers moving with the kind of meticulous precision you only see in people who have been doing the same thing for decades. I won't mince words. We all know Robert was a successful man. His estate is considerable. The majority of his assets, including the firm, his real estate holdings, and his investment portfolio, are all outlined here." Jessica's head snapped up from her phone. Daniel finally tore his gaze away from the window. This was the moment they had been waiting for. This was the moment the true, brutal inheritance would be revealed. I braced myself. Frank cleared his throat and opened the first folder. "The will states that the inheritance of all assets is contingent upon the fulfillment of certain conditions." The air went still. Jessica's phone dropped from her hand onto the table with a muffled thud. She looked at Frank, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Contingent? What do you mean, contingent?" "My father's will is not a scavenger hunt." Frank gave her a look that was both empathetic and firm. Robert was a man who believed in hard work and earned rewards. He felt that simply handing over his life's work would diminish its value. He paused, looking directly at Jessica. "Your part, Jessica, is a two-part task. First, you must spend 1 full month working as a volunteer teacher at the Martin Luther King Jr. public school in the city's most underserved district. You are to live there for the duration, in the provided teacher housing, and you are not allowed to use any of your personal funds. Your transportation will be limited to public transit or walking. You are to write a detailed, weekly report of your experiences, and send it to me." Jessica's jaw fell open. She was a woman who lived her life in luxury sedans and high-rise apartments, where she dealt with seven-figure budgets and billion-dollar blueprints. The idea of public transit and a month without her personal assistant was more foreign to her than a trip to Mars. That's ridiculous. It's an insult to my career." Frank didn't flinch. As I said, his will was very specific. If you refuse or if your reports are found to be anything less than honest, your inheritance will be forfeited and given to a foundation for urban development. He then turned his attention to Daniel. "Daniel," he said, his voice softer, "your task is different. For 1 month, you are to get a job. A real job, something where you punch a clock and are paid by the hour. You are to manage your own finances, pay for all your living expenses, and you are not allowed to receive any financial assistance from your mother or your sister. You are to present me with proof of your employment and a detailed budget showing how you spent every dollar you earned." Daniel stared at him, a flicker of outrage in his eyes. He knew I was working. My art is my job. He knew your art was your passion, Frank corrected gently. "This task is about understanding the value of money in a way that doesn't come from a trust fund. If you fail, or if you refuse, your portion of the estate will also be forfeited to an arts education charity for underprivileged children." My mind reeled. Robert had always been so fixated on money, so proud of the vastness of his fortune. The idea that he would willingly place it in jeopardy, that he would potentially give it all away, was a testament to how badly he wanted to change his children. Finally, Frank turned to me, his expression softening further. "Eleanor," he said, his voice losing all traces of professional detachment, "Robert's task for you is different. He requires you to reconcile with an old friend of his, a man named David Miller. He has not spoken to him in 20 years, and the will states that you must be the one to find him and to convince him to meet with you. There are no financial consequences for you if you fail, but Robert wrote that he hoped you would find it in your heart to complete this final wish." I was stunned. I knew nothing of a man named David Miller. I had never even heard Robert mention the name. It felt like a strange, impossible request, completely unrelated to the cruel tests he had created for our children. Jessica slammed her hand on the table. "This is outrageous. We can contest this. It's an insane set of demands." Frank slowly took off his glasses. "You can, of course, contest the will, but Robert was a brilliant lawyer. He had this document meticulously prepared with every loophole closed. His estate is held in a blind trust, and the trustees are bound by law to honor these conditions. To contest, it would be a long, drawn-out process that would cost you a fortune in legal fees and would likely fail. You and Daniel would lose everything, and your father's entire legacy would be signed over to charity." He was very clear about that. He stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. "I believe he wanted you to learn something from this, something about yourselves, something about him." He placed a manila envelope on the table, one for each of us. "These contain the full details of your tasks. I'll be in touch. Good luck." With that, he walked out of the room, leaving us in a stunned silence. The three of us sat there, a family bound by blood and now by a bizarre, impossible set of rules. We had entered that room expecting a clear division of assets, a conclusion to our grief. Instead, Robert had, even in death, found a way to continue the control he had exerted over our lives. And as I looked at the pale, shocked faces of my children, I knew that the real journey had just begun. Robert's last act was not a legacy of wealth, but a challenge, a testament to his desperation to fix a family he had unknowingly broken. The silence in Frank Johnson's office was so heavy you could almost see it, a suffocating blanket of disbelief and anger. Jessica finally broke it, her voice a low, venomous hiss. "This is a joke, a sick, manipulative joke." She snatched the manila envelope from the table, her movements sharp and furious. "He thought he could still control us from the grave. This isn't a will, it's a puppet show." She stormed out of the office without another word, her heels clicking on the marble floor like a countdown to an explosion. Daniel, still seated, ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit from childhood. "He wants me to get a job. A real job," he muttered, the words thick with a bitter irony. My art is my life, it's what I do. He always saw it as a hobby, a little phase I'd grow out of. I guess I was right. He never understood me at all. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for an answer I didn't have. Mom, what is this? What's going on? I picked up my own envelope, the paper feeling thin and fragile in my hands, as if it held not a set of instructions, but the last, desperate breaths of a dying man. I don't know, honey, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I have to find a man named David Miller. He hasn't spoken to your father in 20 years. We left the office and walked to the street in a daze. The city, once our home, now felt alien and threatening. Daniel finally spoke again as we stood on the sidewalk, waiting for a cab. I'm not doing it, Mom. I won't play his game. My work is starting to get noticed. A gallery in Soho wants to feature me. He wants me to throw all of that away for a minimum wage job so he can laugh at me from his grave. The frustration in his voice was palpable, a lifetime of being told he wasn't good enough, and now this final, public humiliation. He's right, you know, Jessica said, suddenly appearing by our side, her phone still in hand. She had clearly been on a call with a lawyer. Her face was set in a grim determination. This is outrageous. It's an abuse of power, a clear case of undue influence. She looked at me, a calculated glint in her eyes. Mom, we'll fight this. We'll find a way to break the will. There has to be a way. My heart sank. That was her answer to everything. When she was a child and scraped her knee, she wanted to sue the playground. Now, it was a will, and she was already calling her legal team. But Robert had been an exceptional lawyer. He would have known every trick in the book. He wouldn't have left a loophole big enough to drive a truck through. Back at the house, the silence was even more oppressive than before. We were a family of three, yet we were three islands, each trapped in their own grief and frustration. I went to the kitchen and made a pot of coffee, the familiar, mundane act a small comfort in the rising chaos. Jessica paced the living room, her phone pressed to her ear as she argued with her attorney. But he had a duty to his heirs. This is clearly punitive. I don't care if it's ironclad, we'll appeal. Daniel sat on the couch, still clutching his envelope, his face a mixture of anger and a deep, soul-crushing sadness. He wasn't just upset about the money, he was hurt. He was a son who felt his father had, in death, confirmed his deepest fear, that he was a disappointment. I set a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked up at me, his eyes raw. He always wanted me to be him, you know, a miniature version of Robert Reed. I couldn't. I know, honey, I said, sitting beside him. I know. I reached for his hand and he didn't pull away. It was the first human contact either of my children had allowed me since Robert passed. Jessica finally hung up her phone, her face flushed with frustration. He says it's going to be an uphill battle. It could take years, and there's no guarantee we'll win. The trust is impenetrable. She looked at us both, her ambition temporarily defeated. But we have to try. We can't just let him get away with this. Get away with what, Jess? Daniel asked, his voice quiet but firm. Making us do something for a change? We just lost our dad, and all you can talk about is the money. Maybe this is what he wanted, for us to realize there's more to life than the bottom line. The accusation hit Jessica like a physical blow. She recoiled, her face hardening into a furious mask. Don't you dare, I'm trying to protect his legacy, his life's work. You were just a kid who lived off his name. What do you know about building something? I know what it feels like to have your passion ripped to shreds by the one person who should have supported you. Your whole life was about pleasing him. Well, guess what, Jess? He's gone. And all we have left is this stupid game he made up for us. Daniel's voice cracked, and his shoulders began to shake with the force of his emotion. I watched them, my heart splitting in two. They were so alike in their pain, yet so different in their reactions. One, a fortress of logic and calculation, the other a well of raw emotion. Robert's last act had been to expose the very fault lines he had so carefully ignored in life. The beautiful, vibrant family portrait Daniel had painted lay in a corner of the room, a silent and ironic witness to the unraveling. I picked it up, my fingers tracing the faded lines of a life that felt a million miles away. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about a family trying to find their way back to each other, a journey that began with a man who had, in death, finally found a way to speak the only language they would listen to. The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. The storm of the night before had left a palpable stillness, like the aftermath of a tornado. Jessica had left before sunrise, her absence marked only by a neatly folded note on the kitchen counter. Gone to the school, will be in touch. There was no word of apology, no flicker of emotion, just a pragmatic statement of her departure. She had chosen to begin the scavenger hunt, as she called it, with the cold, calculated efficiency she applied to everything else. I imagined her, a woman accustomed to cashmere and leather, in a worn-out public school classroom, her designer shoes gathering dust on a floor that had seen decades of children's footprints. Daniel was still here, holed up in his studio in the back of the house. I could hear the faint sounds of a paintbrush being cleaned, the quiet rustle of paper. He had been so hurt, so angry the night before. I knew he was still wrestling with his decision. I made him a cup of coffee and walked back there, the scent of turpentine and old paint a comforting constant in his otherwise chaotic world. He was standing in front of a new canvas, his hands at his sides, lost in thought. He hadn't started painting yet. He was just looking at the blankness, a mirror to his own uncertainty. I put the coffee down on a small table beside him. "You don't have to do it, honey," I said softly, my hand on his shoulder. "It's your life, your passion. Don't let him force you into something you'll resent." He turned to face me, his eyes full of a weary confusion. "He wasn't wrong about one thing, Mom. I've never had to work for money. He always took care of it, always." He gestured to the studio, a space Robert had paid to convert for him as a high school graduation gift. This entire life, it was all a gift, I never earned it. A profound sadness etched itself onto his features. Maybe he wanted me to understand that. Maybe this isn't a test, maybe it's a lesson. And in that moment, I saw a profound shift in him. The rebellious anger that had defined his relationship with his father was giving way to something new, a genuine desire to understand, to change, to prove his own worth not to his father, but to himself. He picked up his phone and typed a message. A few minutes later, a reply came. "I've got an interview tomorrow at a local coffee shop. The owner said they are looking for someone to help with the morning rush." Daniel looked at me, a small, fragile smile on his face. "Wish me luck, Mom." As my children embarked on their own separate, painful journeys, I began mine. My task felt the most impossible, to find a man who had vanished from Robert's life 2 decades ago. I started where all lost things are found these days, online. A quick search for David Miller yielded thousands of results. I narrowed it down to his profession, an architect, just like Jessica, and his age. Finally, I found him, an old newspaper article from 20 years ago. It was about a collapsed building he had designed, a tragedy that had ruined his career and his reputation. The article mentioned he had been Robert's business partner. He had been the one who had taken the fall, and Robert, for all his legal cunning, had left him to rot. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. This wasn't just a simple reconciliation. This was about a betrayal. Robert hadn't asked me to find an old friend. He had asked me to confront a ghost from his past, a man he had wronged. I found his current address listed in a small town 2 hours north of the city. He no longer practiced architecture. His license had been revoked. He ran a small bookstore now, with a little cafe attached. The image of the place, cozy and worn, felt like a world away from the gleaming steel and glass of our life with Robert. The next few weeks were a strange, slow-motion blur. Jessica sent me brief, clipped emails about her experiences. She was frustrated. The kids were difficult, the work was exhausting. But then, a few days in, her emails started to change. She began to mention a student, a little boy named Marcus, who was a brilliant artist but had no support at home. She wrote about the satisfaction of seeing a child finally understand a difficult concept. The to-do list had become a genuine human connection. Daniel, on the other hand, was full of surprising stories. He was working at a small cafe called The Daily Grind. He talked about the satisfaction of making a perfect latte, the unexpected joy of seeing the same customers every day. He was learning how to balance his budget, how to live within his means. He would send me photos of the cash register, of his worn-out apron. He was exhausted, but he was happy. I could hear it in his voice when he called me, a genuine lightness I hadn't heard in years. He was painting, too, but not for galleries or shows. He was painting for himself, a series of portraits of the people he met at the coffee shop. And as I watched them change, I saw the truth of Robert's plan. This wasn't about punishment. It was about forcing us to see the world from a different perspective. He was a man who had been so obsessed with success that he had lost all connection to the things that truly mattered. In death, he was trying to give us a second chance. I still had my own journey to complete, but now, the fear of it was replaced by a grim determination. I would find David Miller. I would confront the ghost from Robert's past. I would learn the truth about the man I had married and the man he had once been. I would do it not for the inheritance, but for my children, so that they might understand that the man who had hurt them was not just a villain, but a flawed human being who was, in his own way, trying to find redemption. The journey had started with anger and grief, but it was slowly, painfully, turning into something else. It was becoming a journey of healing. And as I packed my bag for my trip to the small town, I felt a familiar, quiet purpose return to me. My role in this family had always been to hold things together, and this time I was determined to do it for good. The drive north felt like a passage through time. The gleaming glass towers of the city gave way to rolling green hills, then to sleepy small towns with one main street and a single blinking traffic light. 2 hours later, I pulled into a small parking spot in front of a quaint, old-fashioned storefront. A hand-painted sign above the door read, "The Last Page Bookstore and Cafe." I took a deep breath, the scent of old paper and roasted coffee beans filling the air, and pushed open the heavy wooden door. A bell chimed, and a man looked up from behind a counter stacked high with books. He was in his late 50s, with a shock of gray hair and eyes that held a deep, settled sadness. He had the kind of face that had seen both great joy and immense sorrow. He was David Miller. I knew it instantly. I also knew that, despite his age, he looked years younger than Robert had when he died. There was a peacefulness to him that Robert had never possessed. He smiled faintly, a tired but polite gesture. "Can I help you find something?" he asked, his voice soft, almost a whisper. My heart was pounding. There was no easy way to do this. "I'm not looking for a book," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "I'm Eleanor Reed, Robert's wife." The smile vanished from his face instantly, replaced by a wall of ice. He tensed, his knuckles white against the worn wood of the counter. The sadness in his eyes flared into something else, a cold, hard anger. "I think you have the wrong place," he said, turning away from me. "I don't know anyone named Robert Reed." "Please," I pleaded, stepping closer. I know what he did. I know the company was your creation. I know he left you to take the fall for the building collapse." The words felt like stones in my mouth. I had never spoken of this before, never even knew the full extent of the betrayal until Frank's subtle research had revealed it. He finally turned back to me, his eyes now blazing. "And what do you want from me, Eleanor? Did he send you here to gloat, to rub my nose in the life he stole from me?" His voice rose, a sharp contrast to his earlier softness. "Get out of my shop, now." I stood my ground. "He's dead, David. Robert is dead." The anger drained from him, leaving only the profound, exhausted sadness I had seen before. He leaned against the counter, his shoulders slumping. "Dead," he repeated, the word a heavy sigh. "After all these years, what a waste." I took a deep breath. "He left a will. He left me a task. He wants me to find you, too? To make things right, I think." I opened my purse and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It was of Robert and David, two young, smiling men in their 20s, standing in front of a rickety old garage that was the first home of their company, a lifetime ago. David took the photo from me, his fingers tracing the edges of the faded image. His eyes grew misty, and he fell silent. After a long moment, he gestured to a small table in the corner of the cafe. "Sit," he said, his voice flat. He walked to the espresso machine, his movements slow and deliberate, and made 2 cups of coffee. He placed one in front of me and sat down in the chair opposite, his body language still stiff with resentment. "We were best friends," he began, not looking at me. "From college, we had a dream. We were going to change the world, one design at a time. I was the artist. The creator, Robert, was the legal genius, the man who could read a contract like a map to buried treasure." A bitter smile played on his lips. When the building collapsed, it wasn't my fault. It was a construction company that cut corners. But Robert had a choice. He could have fought for us. He could have used his brilliance to expose them, but it would have been messy. It would have jeopardized his career, his partnerships. He told me he couldn't afford to be dragged down. He cut all ties. The media portrayed me as the reckless architect. Robert played the role of the diligent partner, the one who had tried to warn me. He saved himself and he let me drown. A profound sorrow washed over me. I had always thought Robert was simply a man driven by ambition. Now I saw that he was a man driven by fear. Fear of failure. Fear of losing the social standing he had worked so hard to achieve. He hadn't just betrayed his friend. He had betrayed the young, idealistic man he used to be. The man in the photograph. The real tragedy is that he was a good man once, David continued, his voice barely a whisper now. The kind of man who would stay up all night helping a friend study for an exam. The kind of man who would give away his last dollar to help a stranger. But he got lost. He became so obsessed with the illusion of perfection that he forgot what was real. He looked at me then, his gaze full of a strange pity. He was a good man, Eleanor. He just lost his way. He sold his soul for a perfect life, and then he spent the rest of his years trying to buy it back. And in the end, it was too late. He stood up and walked to a bookshelf, pulling out an old shoebox. He handed it to me. I want you to have this. Maybe it will help you understand. I think he wanted you to see it. Inside were old photographs, letters, and a video cassette. One letter in particular caught my eye. It was addressed to Robert, dated from 20 years ago. It was from Robert's father, William. The words were simple, yet they held a devastating weight. Robert, I see what you did to your friend. I am so disappointed. The truth has a price, my son, and one day you will have to pay for it. Tears welled in my eyes, the truth about Robert's past, the reason for his father's distant affection, the source of his profound sadness. It was all here in this small, dusty box. He hadn't asked me to fix a betrayal, but to witness a man's regret. He had sent me here not for an act of forgiveness, but for a final act of honesty. The man I had loved and the man I had married were two different people. And as I stared at the evidence of his betrayal and his deep, secret shame, I finally began to understand the full, tragic cost of a life built on lies. He had been trying to fix himself, to buy his way back to the person he used to be, but in the end, it wasn't enough. The shoebox sat in the passenger seat of my car, a time capsule of a life I never knew. I drove home in a daze, the scenic views of the countryside a blurry backdrop to the images playing in my mind. The young, smiling Robert in the faded photograph, the bitter letter from his father, the deep, profound betrayal that had defined his adult life. I had gone searching for a reason for his final, bizarre act, and I had found something far more complex. A man tormented by his own choices, a soul lost to his own ambition. When I arrived at the house, it felt different. It no longer felt like a museum or a mausoleum, but like a place where secrets had been kept, where a ghost had lived for 20 years. Daniel was in the living room, sketching in a notebook, but he looked up as I walked in. He must have seen the exhaustion and the weight on my face. "Mom, what happened?" he asked, his voice full of a genuine concern I hadn't heard in years. I didn't answer right away. I placed the shoebox on the coffee table and sat down heavily on the couch. "Your father? He wasn't who we thought he was," I said, the words catching in my throat. "He was once a different man, a man who was full of hope and integrity." Daniel looked at me, confused. I pulled out the old video cassette, a relic from a bygone era, and found an ancient player in a closet. I slipped the tape in, and we sat on the couch in the dim light, watching a piece of our history come to life. The grainy video flickered to life on the screen. It was a home movie, shaky and unedited. It showed a younger, happier Robert with a full head of dark hair, his face alight with laughter. He was chasing a 6-year-old Jessica through a park, his arms outstretched, his voice full of a playful joy. He didn't look like a successful lawyer. He looked like a proud father, a man completely and utterly in love with his daughter. He was gentle, present, and his eyes held a softness that I hadn't seen in decades. Then the camera panned to a young Daniel, no more than 3 years old, sitting on his father's lap. Robert was teaching him how to draw, his large, capable hands guiding Daniel's small fingers to form a line on the paper. The look on Robert's face was one of pure, unadulterated love. Jessica walked into the room just then, her face drawn and tired. She was still in her work clothes, but her posture had lost its usual rigid perfection. She stopped dead when she saw the video. She watched her father, her younger self, her brother. A single tear tracked its way down her cheek, a surrender to the overwhelming wave of emotion. He was so happy then, she whispered, her voice cracking. I don't remember him like this. He was, I confirmed, my own eyes welling up. We all were. We sat in silence, mesmerized by the images. We saw a man who had been a devoted husband, a doting father, a loving friend. We saw the man he had been before the betrayal, before the crushing weight of ambition and the fear of failure had changed him. We saw what we had lost. The video ended with a final, lingering shot of the family standing together, Robert's arm around my waist, his smile genuine, not professional. A single line of text appeared on the screen, shaky and typed. It was the last message of a man who had lost everything, a final, desperate attempt to communicate with the family he had broken. I'm sorry for what I became. I'm sorry for what I put you through. I lost my way. The screen went black, but the message remained etched in our minds. The finality of it was heartbreaking. We had always seen him as a villain, a man who had sacrificed our happiness for his own gain. But here, in this raw, honest moment, we saw him as a human being. A man who had made a series of terrible choices and had lived with a secret shame for 20 years. A man who, in his final moments, had desperately wanted to be understood. Daniel was the first to speak, his voice thick with emotion. I was so angry at him for everything, for what he said to me that night, for never understanding my art. He looked at me, a profound sadness in his eyes. He wasn't trying to hurt me, was he? He was just afraid. He was afraid I would end up like him, wasting my life on something that didn't pay the bills. Jessica, who had never admitted to a moment of regret in her life, was now weeping silently. All I ever wanted was to be like him, she said, her voice a fragile whisper. To be the perfect, successful daughter. I thought that's what he wanted. I spent my whole life chasing his approval, his legacy. She looked at Daniel and me, her face a mask of grief. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I was so awful. I'm so sorry I made everything about the money. I didn't know how to grieve. I didn't know how to feel. I reached out my hand to Jessica, and she took it, her fingers gripping mine with a desperation I had never felt from her before. Daniel reached for her hand, too, and in that small, quiet moment, we were a family again. A family that had just learned a hard, brutal truth, but a family nonetheless. We had spent our lives chasing a man who was running from himself. And now that he was gone, his last, desperate act was to force us to stop running, too. The inheritance wasn't a reward, it was a final, painful lesson. A call for forgiveness, not for him, but for us. For each other. The video cassette, a silent witness to a life of hidden pain, sat on the coffee table for days. No one had the heart to put it away. It felt like a tether to the man we had lost and a reminder of the raw, fragile honesty that had finally broken the ice between us. The house, once a fortress of quiet resentment, now felt like a home again, filled with tentative conversations and a shared sense of purpose. Daniel and Jessica, who had barely spoken since Robert's death, now had long, late-night conversations in the kitchen. They talked about their childhoods, about the pressure to succeed, about the fear of disappointing their father. Jessica confessed how she had always felt she had to be perfect to earn his love, while Daniel admitted he had always rebelled because he felt that no matter what he did, he would never be enough. It was a painful but necessary process, a tearing down of walls that had been built over a lifetime of misunderstanding. One evening, I found Jessica sitting on the floor of the living room, surrounded by her old college textbooks and blueprints. She looked up at me, a rare, genuine smile on her face. Mom, remember how Dad always wanted me to build things that would last? I think I finally understand what he meant. She gestured to a new set of blueprints she was working on. I'm redesigning the school where I'm working. The one he sent me to. It's falling apart. I'm doing it pro bono. They deserve a place that's safe and beautiful. Her voice was soft, devoid of the usual professional jargon. She wasn't building a skyscraper for a client. She was building a safe haven for children. She was finally using her talent to create something with soul. Daniel was changing too. He came home from his job at the coffee shop, smelling of espresso and a quiet contentment I had never seen on his face. He showed me a painting he had been working on in his spare time, a portrait of the barista he worked with, a kind, elderly man who had shared his life story over lattes and cleanup duty. The painting wasn't just a portrait, it was a story, a testament to a life of quiet dignity. He taught me that real art isn't about fame or money, Mom, Daniel said, his voice full of an unexpected wisdom. It's about connection. It's about seeing the humanity in people you would otherwise pass by. It's about being present. I knew then that my children were on the right path. They were fulfilling their father's final, strange request, not out of a desire for money, but out of a need to heal themselves. They were finding a way to forgive him by understanding his pain. They were building a legacy, not of wealth, but of compassion and empathy. I decided to call Frank Johnson and tell him what we had discovered. He listened patiently as I explained everything: the video cassette, the letters, the story of David Miller's betrayal. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I know, Frank finally said, his voice a quiet sigh. I've known for years. Robert came to me after it happened in pieces. He was never the same. He told me he sold his soul to climb the ladder, and he didn't know how to buy it back. Frank's voice was filled with a deep, weary sadness. He trusted me to protect his legacy, and I promised him I would. That's why he made the will the way he did. He knew he was about to die, and he knew it was his last chance to get you all to see the truth. The truth about him or the truth about us? I asked. Both, Frank said softly. He wanted you to realize that you could be successful without losing your soul. He wanted his children to have a chance at a different life. He wanted to give them the freedom he had lost. The next day, Daniel and Jessica made a final, powerful decision. They decided to host a small, private memorial for Robert, not a party for his business associates, but a quiet gathering of those who had loved him and a few who had been hurt by him. Jessica insisted on inviting David Miller, despite my warnings. She believed it was the only way to truly honor her father's final wishes. David showed up looking nervous and out of place. He stood in a corner, a quiet ghost in a room full of people. But at the end of the night, Daniel walked over to him, hands in his pockets. My name is Daniel, he said, his voice steady. You used to know my dad. He wanted me to tell you that he's sorry. David looked at him, tears welling in his eyes. He didn't say a word. He simply nodded, a gesture of silent forgiveness. And in that moment, I realized that the greatest inheritance Robert could have left us wasn't a bank account or a law firm. It was a family. A family that had been broken by his lies but was finally, truly, beginning to heal. A family that had learned that forgiveness was not a gift you gave to someone else, but a gift you gave to yourself. The quiet memorial had come and gone, leaving behind a profound sense of peace. The house, once full of ghosts, now felt lived in, full of the kind of easy silence that only comes from true understanding. Daniel had returned to his art with a renewed passion, his canvases no longer filled with angry, abstract forms, but with vibrant human faces. Jessica, too, had found a new purpose. Her emails about the school project now filled with a genuine excitement that was a stark contrast to her usual businesslike tone. We were healing. We were a family again. Then the phone rang. It was Frank Johnson. His voice, usually so calm and measured, held a note of urgency I hadn't heard since the day Robert died. Eleanor, he said without preamble, I need you all to come to my office. Immediately. A familiar, cold dread settled in my stomach. The peace we had found felt fragile, as if it could shatter at any moment. I called the kids, and within the hour, we were all back in the oak-paneled office that had once felt so menacing. This time, the mood was different. We were no longer adversaries. We were a united front. Frank looked at us, his tired eyes holding a mix of weariness and a strange kind of pride. He didn't sit down. He just stood there, his hands clasped behind his back, a silent testament to the gravity of the moment. I have something to tell you, something Robert instructed me to only reveal when I was sure you were on the right path. He left a final, secret clause in the will. Jessica's face hardened. Another one of his games? She said, her voice laced with the old skepticism. Frank shook his head. No, this isn't a game. This is the final truth. Robert's inheritance was not as secure as you all believed. He had gambled heavily on a few high-risk investments that had gone south in the months before his death. The firm was not in great shape either. He was close to financial ruin. My breath caught in my throat. This was the man who had preached success and legacy. The man who had judged his children for not being practical enough. The man who had, in secret, been facing a devastating failure. He was terrified of losing everything, Frank continued, his voice low, of losing the image he had spent his entire life building. He knew he didn't have much time left. He came to me with a plan. He said he couldn't face losing his children and his fortune at the same time. He had to save something, so he created the will. The challenges, the conditions. Why? Daniel asked, his voice barely a whisper. What was the point of all this? What was the secret clause? Frank took a deep breath. The will was never about giving you the inheritance. The will was about taking it away. He paused, letting the words sink in. If you had refused to play his game, if you had chosen to contest the will, you would have lost everything. The legal battle would have bankrupted the estate. It would have all been a wash. The money would have been gone, and your father's name would have been dragged through the mud. That was the consequence he planned for if you had chosen greed over his lessons. Jessica and Daniel stared at him, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning realization. This was not a test of character. It was a test of love. Robert had forced them to choose between money and each other. And the secret clause? I asked, my voice trembling. The secret clause, Frank said, his eyes filled with a profound sadness, states that if you did choose to embark on this journey, if you did complete the tasks with the true intention of understanding and forgiving your father, and if I, as his trustee, confirmed that your intentions were genuine, he would reveal the final truth, that the inheritance would have been yours, but in a completely different way. He handed each of us a small, sealed envelope. Inside was a simple note in Robert's handwriting. The note for Daniel said, "Your talent is your greatest inheritance. Never let anyone tell you otherwise." For Jessica, it read, "Your heart is the greatest blueprint you will ever follow." And for me, my love for you was the only thing that was ever real. Tears streamed down my face. This wasn't about money. It was about a man who had spent his life living a lie, and in the end, he had tried to give us the only thing that truly mattered, the truth. He had forced us to see that the real legacy was not in the millions he had made, but in the love we had for each other. He had risked it all, not just for his own redemption, but for our healing. He knew he was dying, Eleanor, Frank said, looking at me, and he knew that the only way to save his family was to risk everything. He loved you all, more than he ever showed you. Jessica and Daniel, a tear-soaked family now, stood and embraced. The money, the firm, the real estate, none of it mattered. It was all a mirage, a fragile illusion of success. The real inheritance was in the hugs, in the words of apology, in the quiet, shared understanding that a man's greatest legacy is not what he leaves behind, but who he leaves behind. Robert's last act was not a test of our greed, but a final, desperate, and beautiful act of love. The envelopes from Frank sat on our coffee table for a full day, untouched. We were no longer in a hurry. The weight of Robert's final truth had changed everything. The millions, the firm, the real estate, they were all just numbers now, abstract concepts devoid of the power they once held over us. What mattered was the handwritten note, the final, desperate act of a man trying to give his family the one thing he had never given them in life: emotional honesty. The news of Robert's death had, of course, been widely reported. The legal community in our city was a small, gossipy one, and a man of Robert Reed's stature didn't pass away without drawing a great deal of attention. The rumor mill was already churning, fueled by Frank's cryptic handling of the will. People were speculating about the inheritance, the mysterious conditions, and the potential legal battle. It was a scandal in the making, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down on us. I was in the kitchen making a cup of tea when Jessica walked in. Her face was calm, but her eyes held a determined glint. "Mom," she said, "we need to tell them." "Tell who?" I asked, confused. "Everyone," she said simply. "The partners, the media, the city. We need to tell them the truth, not about the money, but about what happened to our family." about what Dad really wanted. Daniel, who had been in the living room, walked in and nodded in agreement. Jessica's right. Dad lived his whole life hiding behind a facade. We can't let that be his legacy. We have to honor his final wish. I was hesitant. It will be messy. People will have so many questions. They'll think we're crazy. Let them, Jessica said, her voice firm. This isn't for them. This is for us. This is for Dad. So we planned a small private press conference, not in a stuffy law office or a grand ballroom, but in our backyard, in the garden that I had so painstakingly tended for 25 years. It was the only place that felt truly ours, the only place that held a true reflection of the life we had built together, warts and all. We invited a few key reporters, the ones who had covered Robert's career for years, the ones who had a reputation for integrity. The day of the press conference was a beautiful, crisp autumn day. The garden was in full bloom, the air filled with the scent of late-season roses and freshly cut grass. The reporters looked confused, expecting a slick, professional event. Instead, they were met by a mother and her two children, standing side by side on a simple, wooden deck. I stood in the middle, with Jessica on my right and Daniel on my left. My hands, which had been trembling just moments before, were perfectly steady. I looked at the familiar faces of the reporters, the people who had seen my family from a distance for so long, and I began to speak. My name is Eleanor Reed, I said, my voice clear and strong. I want to thank you all for coming. We've asked you here today to clear up some misunderstandings about my husband, Robert Reed, and his final wishes. I began to tell them the story. I talked about Robert's love for his family, about his professional success, and about the betrayal that had sent him down a path of secrecy and regret. I spoke of his final, secret plan, the one that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with family. I talked about Jessica's newfound passion for helping children and Daniel's journey to find his own worth. I didn't hold anything back. I revealed the truth about the blind trust, about the legal battle that would have bankrupted the estate, about the moral clauses that were not a test but a final lesson. The reporters were stunned into silence. Their pens were still, their cameras unmoving. They had come for a story about money, about scandal, about greed, but they had found something else entirely. They had found a story about a family trying to heal, about a man who, in death, had found a way to atone for his mistakes. Jessica and Daniel then took turns speaking. Jessica talked about the school, about the little boy named Marcus, about how a life spent building skyscrapers had taught her nothing about truly building a community. Daniel spoke of his art, of the cafe, of the lessons he had learned about a life of quiet dignity. They didn't speak with professional detachment. They spoke from the heart, their voices filled with a raw, powerful honesty. The press conference lasted only 20 minutes, but it changed everything. When we were done, the reporters didn't ask us about the money. They asked us about Robert, about the man behind the legacy, about the father who had sacrificed everything for his children. The news of the perfect family that had been on the brink of collapse went viral. The story of Robert's final act of love became a viral sensation, a testament to the power of forgiveness and redemption. The next day, my phone rang. It was David Miller. I saw the press conference, Eleanor, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm so sorry for what I said, for what I thought. He was a good man once, and I see now that he never really stopped trying to be. Thank you for doing this. I knew then that our journey was complete. Robert's last act had not only saved his family, but had also restored his name. His legacy would not be defined by the money he made or the buildings he built, but by the love and forgiveness he had, in the end, managed to leave behind. The press conference in our backyard had felt like a final exhale. The story of Roberts will become a national sensation, a viral testament to the power of forgiveness and the true meaning of legacy. The millions he had so desperately guarded became an afterthought, a footnote in the story of a man who, in death, had finally found a way to be honest. The law firm, once a source of pride and a point of contention, was no longer a symbol of his ambition, but a reminder of the fragility of a life built on a foundation of lies. The final details of the will were handled by Frank, who ensured that the trust was dissolved and the assets were distributed just as Robert had intended. Jessica and Daniel took their inheritance and did exactly what their father had wanted. Jessica used her share to create a non-profit foundation dedicated to building schools in underserved communities. Her first project was the one she had been working on, a complete overhaul of the Martin Luther King Jr. public school. She poured her heart and soul into it, no longer driven by a desire for fame or money, but by a genuine passion for creating a place where children could thrive. She started an art program, and the first piece of art she commissioned was a mural for the school's gymnasium, a collaboration between her and Daniel. Daniel, with his share, opened a small art gallery and community center. He called it the Everlasting Testament. The gallery was not for profit. He used it as a space to showcase the work of young, unknown artists, to host workshops for at-risk youth, and to teach others that art was not a hobby, but a form of communication, a way to connect with the world. He was no longer just a painter. He was a mentor, a guide, a man who had found his purpose in giving others the support he had never received. And me? I found a new sense of purpose in the stillness of our home. I enrolled in art classes, not to become a professional, but to simply create, to express the thoughts and emotions I had kept buried for so long. I took long walks in the garden, a place that no longer felt like a chore, but like a place of refuge. The old, worn-out shoes I had replaced in my closet became a symbol of a life I had left behind, a life of being a wife, a life of being a mother, a life of being a woman in the shadows. I was finally just me, Ellie, and it was enough. One day, on an unusually warm afternoon, I was in the garden, tending to the roses, when I heard a soft knock at the gate. It was David Miller. He had a small box in his hands. He smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached his eyes. "I brought you something," he said softly. Inside the box was a small, beautifully crafted book, bound in leather. It was a collection of his and Robert's old architectural drawings from their college days. The designs were filled with a wild, passionate abandon, a raw genius that had been lost over time. "I wanted you to see the dreams we had," he said, his voice full of a quiet grace. "Before everything went wrong, he was a good man, Eleanor. He just lost his way. Thank you for helping him find his way back home." We sat in the garden for hours, not talking about the past, but about the future, about a new friendship that had blossomed from the wreckage of the old. The house, once a symbol of a life of pretense, became a place of healing. It was here that we had all unburdened ourselves, where we had found a way to forgive. It was no longer a house full of ghosts, but a home full of love and laughter and the quiet understanding that a family's greatest inheritance isn't in the things you leave behind, but in the love you hold on to. A few months later, on the first anniversary of Robert's death, we all gathered in the backyard. Jessica, Daniel, and I stood in a circle, holding hands. We didn't talk about money or about the law firm. We talked about the man we had loved, the man we had lost, and the man he had in the end become. We laughed about his terrible jokes, we cried about the time he spent away, and we celebrated the incredible, beautiful, and sometimes devastating lessons he had taught us. The sun set, casting a golden hue over the garden, and we knew that our story wasn't over. It was just beginning. It was a story not of wealth, but of family. A story that had started with a will and had ended with love. Thank you for being a part of our story. We wish you and your family all the health and happiness in the world.